Hey guys, it's me, Mr. Bright, and I'm going to be reading a story over the next, probably next couple of weeks, and I figured it would be a good way to end our school year. We started reading this, the first part of this book in class during kind of our read alouds after lunch, and well, not this book, but the book that was the first one, which was Sideways Stories from Wayside School. And then I found this book here, Wayside School is Falling Down. And this is kind of the second book in that series. So I thought it would be a fun way to end. And so I'll be reading a little bit of each of this book each day, and probably a chapter or two, depending on how long the chapters are. And hopefully posting them on our Community 3 Google Classroom so that you guys can watch them if you want. So here we go. Chapter 1 is a package for Mrs. Jules, and there's a little picture. Louis, the art teacher, frowned. The schoolyard was a mess. There were pencils and pieces of paper everywhere. How'd all this junk get here, he wondered. Well, I'm not going to pick it up. It wasn't his job to pick up garbage. He was just supposed to pass out the balls during lunch and recess and also make sure the kids didn't kill each other. He sighed, then began cleaning it up. He loved all the children at Wayside School. He didn't want them playing on a dirty playground. As he was picking up the pencils and pieces of paper, a large truck drove into the parking lot. It honked its horn twice, then twice more. Louis ran to the truck. Quiet, he whispered. Children are trying to learn in there. He pointed at the school. A short man with big bushy hair stepped out of the truck. I have a package for somebody named Mrs. Jules, he said. I'll take it, said Louis. Are you Mrs. Jules? Asked the man. No, said Louis. I have to give it to Mrs. Jules, said the man. Louis thought a moment. He didn't want the man disrupting the children. He knew how much they hated to be interrupted when they were working. I'm Mrs. Jules, he said. But you just said you weren't Mrs. Jules, said the man. I changed my mind, said Louis. The man got the package out of the back of the truck and gave it to Louis. Here you go, Mrs. Jules, he said. Ugh, Louis grunted. It was a very heavy package. The word fragile was printed on every side. He had to be careful not to drop it. The package was so big, Louis didn't see where he was going. Fortunately, he knew the way to Mrs. Jules' class by heart. It was straight up. Wayside School was 30 stories high with only one room on each story. Mrs. Jules' class was at the very top. It was Louis's favorite class. He pushed through the door to the school, then started up the stairs. There was no elevator. There were stairs that led down to the basement too, but nobody ever went there. There were dead rats living in the basement. The box was pressed against Louis's face, squashing his nose. Even so, when he reached the 15th floor, he could smell Miss Mush cooking in the cafeteria. It smelled like she was making mushrooms. Maybe on the way back I'll stop by Miss Mush's room and get some mushrooms, he thought. He didn't want to miss Miss Mush's mushrooms. They were her specialty. He huffed and groaned and continued up the stairs. His arms and legs were very sore, but he didn't want to rest. This package might be important, he thought. I have to get it to Mrs. Jules right away. He stepped easily from the 18th story to the 20th. There was no 19th story. Miss Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. There was no Miss Zarves. At last, he struggled up the final step to the 30th story. He knocked on Mrs. Jules' door with his head. Mrs. Jules was in the middle of teaching her class about gravity when she heard the knock. Come in, she called. I can't open the door, Louis gasped. My hands are full. I have a package for you. Mrs. Jules faced the class. Who wants to open the door for Louis? She asked. All the children raised their hands. They loved to be interrupted when they were working. Oh dear, how shall I choose? Asked Mrs. Jules. I have to be fair about this. I know. We'll have a spelling bee, and the winner will get to open the door. Louis knocked his head against the door again. It's heavy, he complained, and I'm very tired. Just a second, Mrs. Jules called back. Allison, the first word's for you. Heavy. Heavy, said Allison. H-E-A-V-Y. Heavy. Very good. Jason, you're next. Tired. Tired, said Jason. S-L-E-E-P-Y. Tired. Louis felt the package slipping from his sweaty fingers. He shifted the weight to get a better grip. The corners of the box dug into the sides of his arms. He felt his hands go numb. Actually, he didn't feel them go numb. Jenny, package. Package, said Jenny. B-O-X. Package. Excellent, said Mrs. Jules. Louis felt like he was going to faint. At last, John opened the door. I won the spelling bee, Louis, he said. Very good, John, muttered Louis. Aren't you going to shake my hand? Asked John. Louis shifted the box to one arm, quickly shook John's hand, then grabbed the box again and staggered into the room. "Where do you want it, Mrs. Jules?" he asked. "I don't know," said Mrs. Jules. "What is it?" "I don't know," said Louis. "I'll have to put it down someplace so you can open it." "But how can I tell you where to put it if I don't know what it is?" asked Mrs. Jules. "You might put it in the wrong place." So Louis held the box as Mrs. Jules stood on a chair next to him and tore open the top. His legs wobbled beneath him. "It's a computer!" exclaimed Mrs. Jules. Everybody booed. "What's the matter?" asked Louis. "I thought everyone loved computers." "We don't want it, Louis," said Eric Bacon. "Take it back, Jack," said Terence. "Get that piece of junk out of here," said Mauricia. "Now, don't be that way," said Mrs. Jules. "The computer will help us learn. It's a lot quicker than a pencil and paper." "But the quicker we learn, the more work we have to do," complained Todd. "You may set it over there on the counter, Louis," said Mrs. Jules. Louis set the computer on the counter next to Sherry's desk. Then he collapsed on the floor. "Now watch closely," said Mrs. Jules. Everyone gathered around the new computer. It had a full-color monitor and 2 disk drives. Mrs. Jules pushed it out the window. They all watched it fall and smash against the sidewalk. "See," said Mrs. Jules. "That's gravity." "Oh, now I get it," said Joe. "Thank you, Louis," said Mrs. Jules. "I've been trying to teach them about gravity all morning. We had been using pencils and pieces of paper, but the computer was a lot quicker." Chapter 2. Mark Miller. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell. "I would like you to meet Mark Miller," she said. "He and his family just moved here all the way from Macedonia." Everybody stared at the new kid. He stood at the front of the room. His knees were shaking. He hated having to stand in front of the class. It was as if Mrs. Jules had brought him in for show and tell. He felt like some kind of weirdo. He just wanted to sit at a desk and be like everybody else. But worst of all, his name wasn't Mark Miller. He was Benjamin Nushmut, and he had moved from Hempleton, not Macedonia. But he was too scared to mention that to Mrs. Jules. He was afraid to correct a teacher. "Why don't you tell the class a little bit about yourself, Mark?" suggested Mrs. Jules. Benjamin didn't know what to say. He wished he really was Mark Miller. Mark Miller wouldn't be scared, he thought. He'd probably have lots to say. Everyone would like him. Nobody would think Mark Miller was weird. "Well, I guess we'd better find you a place to sit," said Mrs. Jules. She put him at the empty desk between Todd and Beebe. "Hi, Mark," said Todd. "I'm Todd." "You'll like Mrs. Jules. She's the nicest teacher in the school." "Todd, no talking," said Mrs. Jules. "Go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline." "Hi, Mark," said Beebe. "I'm Baby Gunn." "Hi," Benjamin said quietly. He decided he'd have to tell Mrs. Jules his real name at recess. He cringed. He didn't know why, but for some reason he had trouble saying his own name. "And what's your name, little boy?" an adult would ask him. "Benjamin Nushmut," he'd answer. "What?" "Benjamin Nushmut." "What?" "Benjamin Nushmut." "What?" "Benjamin Nushmut." "What?" "Benjamin Nushmut." "Oh, nice to meet you, Benjamin." He never knew what it was that made the person suddenly understand. When the bell rang for recess, everyone charged out of the room. Benjamin slowly walked to Mrs. Jules' desk. Somehow he had to tell her. Mrs. Jules was sorting paper. Papers. "Oh, hello, Mark," she said. "How are you enjoying the class so far?" "Fine," said Benjamin. "Good. I'm glad to hear that," said Mrs. Jules. Benjamin shrugged, then walked out of the room. If I had told her my name, she would have thought I was weird for not telling her sooner, he realized. He stood at the top of the stairs and looked down. Recess was only 10 minutes long. It didn't seem worth it to go all the way down, then come all the way back up. He didn't have any friends down there anyway. He had never been more unhappy in his whole life. He sat on the top step. "Mark Miller," he said out loud. It was an easy name to say. Mark Miller probably would have made lots of friends by now, he thought. Suddenly he heard a low rumble. Then the stairs began to shake. It felt like an earthquake. This whole stupid school is going to fall over, he thought. He put his head between his knees. The rumbling got worse. "I'm going to die, and nobody will even know who I am," he worried. The new kid, Mark Miller, the weirdo. But it wasn't an earthquake. It was just all the kids running back up the stairs. "Hey, Mark, why are you sitting that way?" asked Dee Dee. "You look funny," said Ron. Benjamin looked up. "How come you weren't at recess?" asked Jason. "We looked everywhere for you." "Couldn't find the playground?" asked Calvin. "It's just straight down," said Beebe. "You can't miss it." "Oh, but don't go in the basement," warned Cherry. "Whatever you do, don't go in the basement." "We'll go down together at lunch," said Todd. "That way you won't get lost." Benjamin smiled. He was glad everyone seemed to like him. Or at least they liked Mark Miller. He was wondering if they'd like Benjamin Nushmut too. "The bell has rung," said Mrs. Jules, standing in the doorway. "Now everyone get inside." She made Todd put a check next to his name on the board for being late. Mrs. Jules handed a stack of worksheets to Damien and asked him to pass them out to the rest of the class. Benjamin looked at his worksheet. At the top right corner there was a place to put his name. He didn't know which name to put there, Mark Miller or Benjamin Nushmut. He left it blank and started working on the first problem. Louis, the art teacher, entered the room carrying a white paper sack. "Benjamin forgot his lunch," he said. "His mother just brought it." "Who?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Benjamin," said Louis. "There's no Benjamin in my class," said Mrs. Jules. "Are you sure?" asked Louis. "It looks like a good lunch." "I know the names of the children in my class," Mrs. Jules said indignantly. "Well, I'll just leave it here until I figure this out," said Louis. He left the lunch on Mrs. Jules' desk and walked out of the room. Benjamin frowned. He looked at the white paper sack on Mrs. Jules' desk. He couldn't tell Mrs. Jules' real name now. She'd think he was making it up just to get a free lunch. He wrote Mark Miller at the top of his worksheet. But one of these days, he knew he'd have to tell her his real name. That is it for today.